And now our next speaker, it's my honor to introduce our first speaker of the day. So you will all get to be here for the momentous occasion of Dr. introducing Dr. Frisby. I'm excited about this. We've heard a lot yesterday, of course, about the European theater, and we'll talk more about the European theater later today, but this will be a fantastic exploration of the Pacific theater, and in particular, the USS Tennessee. So without further ado, I'm going to turn over to Derek. Thank you so much. Let's welcome him. Thanks.
All right, thank you very much. Okay. I'll go ahead and start my timer. I'm usually programmed to talk about 85 minutes, but I promise not to do that today. I think I'm limited to just about 40 with some questions, so we'll go ahead and start that. But I do want to say what an honor it is to be here at the East Tennessee Historical Society Conference on World War II. Thank you to them and all their sponsors. Warren, Gay, and all your staff have been really great to me. See a lot of friends and even some former students in the audience, and so it's always good to see those who have carried on the tradition, even against all my advice, to find a more lucrative occupation. It's also great to be back in East Tennessee. My grandmother owned a Holiday Inn just south of here in Alcoa, Tennessee, and lived in Friendsville until she passed away. My father's side of the family is actually one of the first families of Madison County, North Carolina, over in Marshall. So we spent a lot of time over here as kids and growing up, and just a great place to visit. And we still come back and visit on occasion. In fact, we were just down at the Shed for a concert not too long ago. So great to be here. It's interesting that the Churchill people are here. We look forward to seeing that later today. I usually take battlefield trips around the world. I take my students, we've done 3 Band of Brothers trips. We did Sicily, Italy. We've done probably almost 10 Vietnam tours, but the Vietnam tour in recent years has been joined by Westminster College in Missouri, the place where Churchill gave his famous speech there. And Mark Bolton over there at Westminster has been a great colleague to work with on our Vietnam tours. We're probably entering into one of the last Vietnam tours that we'll do, and if you're interested, you can come talk to me, and we'll see about getting you over across the ocean to the Republic of Vietnam. All right, so we'll go ahead and get into this. I do teach Tennessee history at Middle Tennessee State University, along with military history and geography. I'm pretty sure that I've taught more Tennessee history courses than any professor alive at this point. I usually teach between 10 and 12 courses a year with 35 students each. We teach more Tennessee history at MTSU than all the other state universities combined in a single semester. So we're really proud of the history that we do there at MTSU. So thank you to all those, again, the students especially, who make my life possible. So thanks. And to you who've come to listen to this talk today. This started out actually as a Tennessee history course lecture on World War II. Unlike my colleagues who teach American or world or even Western civilization, those professors have 2 semesters to cover a lot. In Tennessee history, unfortunately, we're down to 1 semester. We don't even teach Tennessee history as a standalone course anymore in public schools. I still have my Tennessee history notebook from when I took Tennessee history for a semester in school, but we don't do that anymore. We've integrated it. And so we have to move very quickly. And the only way we could sort of cover any part of at least World War II in this period was to basically go down to a single lecture. So this started out as a single lecture for my course, and I hope you enjoy it today. So we'll go ahead and get started on this. I've titled it Ready to Do Our Full Part, Interpreting Tennessee's World War II Experience via the USS Tennessee. This is a quote from Governor Prentice Cooper, who, when the war started, said that Tennesseans, as the volunteer state, were ready to do our full part. And as you know, the United States Navy has a tradition of naming many of its capital ships after states. And the USS Tennessee was a very important part of the U.S. Navy, as you'll see in just a moment. And so it's interesting to be able to follow the USS Tennessee and other Tennesseans, at least today, in the Pacific campaign. I should say that I owe a debt of gratitude to a couple of people. The University of Tennessee's own Jonathan Utley, who taught here several years ago, published a book called An American Battleship at Peace and War, the USS Tennessee, back in 1991. And if you're interested in all the technical specifications and details and minutia of naval architecture and those kind of things, this is a great book. But it also is a really good book, as the University of Tennessee has this the Great Center for Warfare and Culture. It also does a great job of integrating a lot of the culture of what the USS Tennessee meant to the people, because that's the Navy tradition. Naming these capital ships after the individual states was meant to give the states and its citizens a sense of ownership, a sense of participation, that they could follow their namesake ship throughout various campaigns. And I think in this case, the USS Tennessee, with our volunteer state traditions, acquitted itself rather well during the time period that it served. The other person is Robert Ickert, who wrote an article in the Tennessee Historical Quarterly just before Utley's book came out, called the SS Tennessees, and it was sort of a history of the various ships that have been called Tennessee or named Tennessee in their history. The battleship Tennessee that we're going to talk about today is actually Tennessee number 6. There were 5 other ships that followed it. I've got a couple up here on the screen. We won't go into great detail on this, but the first 2 actually were both not only Confederate ships, but Union ships. They were either captured and then later commissioned in the U.S. Navy. There's a second one in between the top 2 pictures there that was started at Memphis but never completed. They destroyed it rather than let the Union Army capture it at Memphis. So there were 3 essentially that started during the Civil War period. And then the post-Civil War period saw a number of different types of frigates as the United States Navy was trying to figure out how to use steam and sail together. And you can see the screw frigate Tennessee there from 1865 to 1877. Not only does it have steam power, it also has sail. So they were trying to figure this out. I will point out that typically the Tennessee is often considered one of the best ships in the Navy for a number of reasons. But this screw frigate, the third picture there, was said to be the largest vessel then in commission in the U.S. Navy. And it demonstrates all that is excellent and majestic in ship construction. So it was a very important part of the U.S. Navy's transition from sail to steam. Now, most people would probably recognize this USS Tennessee from the early 20th century. This was sort of an armored cruiser battleship kind of type, and it was the first fully armored battleship, part of that Great White Fleet period of the early 20th century. And I believe the Mississippi also had one of these. If you look at the bow on this armored cruiser, it's rather ornate. And today, that bow is in Centennial Park in Nashville. Now, these are pictures of the bow when it was put there in Centennial Park many years ago. If you go there today, it's not in really great condition, and I hope that we can find a way to sort of better preserve that piece of our history, as we go forward in this. So just in case you're in Centennial Park next time, try to find it and see what kind of condition it is. Hopefully we can do better. But this armored cruiser accompanied Teddy Roosevelt to Panama during that period and those kind of things. It supposedly outran the Louisiana on its way back from Panama and was considered one of the fastest, strongest ships in the Navy at that point. And it lasted until around 1916 as the USS Tennessee. I know you see the 1922 designation up there. In 1916, the Navy decided to build a battleship class called the Tennessee class, of which the Tennessee would be one of those new battleships. And so they changed the name of this armored cruiser from the USS Tennessee to USS Memphis. And USS Memphis was in the Caribbean when it was essentially swamped by a rogue wave. Some people call it a tsunami, but later historians have said that it was not a geologic event that caused the wave, but rather a series of hurricanes that season that caused a wave of about, some people say 90 feet to wash over the Tennessee, and luckily did not turn it over, but did run it onto the shore and essentially destroyed it. 40 men lost their lives, and several hundred others were wounded or injured in that event. So that's the demise of that version of the Tennessee. That was Tennessee number 5. But our subject today is Tennessee number 6. The Super Dreadnought Tennessee, which was said to be in the New York Times of May 4th, 1919, the most powerful naval battle unit built in the history of the world. Although it will be of the Tennessee class, over on the West Coast, as the Tennessee is being built in New York. On the West Coast, its sister ship, the USS California, was commissioned just a few weeks earlier than the Tennessee. So the Tennessee, the namesake of the class, was actually the second ship launched. But here you can see it being launched into the ocean. There were a lot of concerns about this. They weren't sure, given the scale and the size of the hull, that this would work. That when they launched it, it was some very tense moments. But they did eventually christen the ship. Now, some very interesting things about this. Here's another newspaper article, for this time from the Evening World in New York. World's greatest battleship is launched. 100,000 persons cheer. Helen Roberts, the governor's daughter, was named sort of the ship's maiden or the sponsor of the ship. She's the one that smashes the champagne bottle on the hull and everything else. And you can see her here launching the ship. And what I always tell my students is you have to be observant. Sometimes, as historians, we get tunnel vision. I had a professor one time joke that he spent more time in the 18th century than he did in the 20th century because of all the research that he did. And I kind of feel that way now too, especially since it's a lot easier. We don't have the big microfilm machines to go through anymore. We've got all these things digitized. But if you look at this newspaper, of course, you're looking at the Tennessee because that's the subject of what we're talking about today. But there's a lot of other things going on in this newspaper that have intrigued me over the years. 77th Heroes of Argonne reach home over there on one side of the screen. This is a very famous unit in France that's coming home. And so that's an interesting story. If you look over on the other side, you can see fancy clothes and sodas cost more tomorrow. We sometimes talk in our class about sin taxes or taxes that the government puts in place to keep us from doing things that they believe we shouldn't. Especially recently, you've seen the sugar taxes in various states and cities and so forth. But this is 1919, and they're already talking about sugar taxes. They're going to make sodas cost more, and even what's considered fancy clothes cost more. And then the one that I'm probably going to, hopefully if I ever retire, I can go back and figure out what happened here. If you look down there at the bottom towards one side of the screen, the headline is, "Thinks her daughter 12 has eloped with a soldier." And her mother believed, and it gives her address and everything. You couldn't do this today. My child left with a young man about 5 o'clock in the afternoon, and calling on Helen Lewis, a friend of whatever, now giving everybody's address, told her she's leaving with Sergeant Joseph Smith. She said she was going out of town. I really want to find out what happened there. Yeah, sometimes you gotta see the forest for the trees, I think. But lots of interesting stuff in the newspapers. Here's another picture of the christening ceremony, the launch ceremony. Here you can see Helen Roberts with her father on one side. And there's a strange-looking guy next to Helen Roberts. You may recognize him in the black tall hat. That is the Secretary of the Navy, Franklin Roosevelt, who has some part to play in the future of this story. But it's interesting, I look at this picture, and this is sort of going into the summer of 1919 and thinking about what Governor Roberts is going to have to deal with in the next coming year, especially with women's suffrage. Of course, famously, he was not a supporter of women's suffrage. There are a lot of rumors as to how the special session got called the next year, but just kind of wonder what's in his mind a year from now. All right, so here we go. Let's talk about the battleship Tennessee. Again, as I said, bigger and better than any dreadnought afloat. Most powerful floating fortress, the giant Tennessee leads Navy into the world. Here you can see another graphic from one of the newspapers. It's got the Washington Monument. That's the Woolworth Building in New York. And then you can see the battleship Tennessee reaching almost into the heavens. I like how they sort of have done the heavens thing in there. Another interesting part about this picture, this is the USS Tennessee as it leaves in 1920 after it's been fitted out and they're getting ready for sea trials and those kind of things. It appears that some sensors have gone over the picture and blotted out some of the radars and other equipment on the ship, if you can look pretty closely. So that's interesting that even as early as 1920, sensors are looking at these photographs and actually trying to censor them in some way. This is a painting from a later time with the battleship Tennessee, but in the 1920s, it was kind of a slow period for the Navy. There was a lot of anti-militarist sentiment going on, not only in the world but in the United States. It was not very popular to be in the military. There was a lot of talk about the cost and the expense and obviously the dangers coming out of World War I with all the death and destruction. So sailors had to find all kinds of things to do to relax. And by all accounts, the Tennessee Rebels, as they tend to call themselves, were a great set of athletes. No matter what period throughout the 1920s and 30s you're looking at, they were boxers. They won basketball tournaments throughout the fleet, baseball tournaments. They were pretty successful as an athletic club, all in of themselves. Here you can see they were also considered some of the best gunners in the Navy. Here you can see the size of their 14-inch guns with all the men sort of hanging from the barrels here, and then they were posing with their targets around 1925 when they won a gunnery competition. And this gives them sort of the big E. If you ever look at a battleship, it has a set of honors and things that probably aren't familiar to most civilians, but the big E would have been there for excellence on that. And again, it's in the 1920s with this anti-militarist sentiment that you see people talking about, do we really need these? What's the point? This is a newspaper article. I'm not sure why it only lists 6. There are 12 guns on the Tennessee, but it says that basically each of these guns cost $116,000 at that time. Each shot was $900, a salvo $10,800. So if you look at inflation for today, that's about $14,000 per round, and about $169,000 every time all of the guns fire at once. If you've been in the military, you know what a thrill it is to actually get to fire live ammunition, especially things that cost significantly more than just bullets. When I was in a weapons company in the Marine Corps, I was a machine gunner, but we always loved to go out with the anti-tank people and watch them fire the live anti-tank rounds, which we were told cost about $14,000 each at that time. I'm not going to tell you when that was because I don't want you to do the inflation math. But today, a Tomahawk cruise missile, which we still use, we just used a few over in the Gulf of Aden against the Houthi rebels in Yemen. They're about $2 million each. And a Hellfire missile that we use on our drones today costs about $150,000 each. Now, another interesting part about the culture at this period of time, yes, there's a lot of anti-militarism going around, but there's evidence that people wanted to be associated with the Tennessee for commercial purposes, right? You probably don't see this too much today, but Westinghouse had an article, electrified. Wouldn't you like to have the kind of electric power that's on board the best ship and the most modern ship in the Navy, right? The USS Tennessee. And here's, wouldn't you want to have the cookware ladies that the same sailors use? And I shouldn't have said ladies. There's a lot of men who like to cook as well. But again, talking about all the technical specifications of this battleship, and yet it is equipped with the wherever aluminum steel jacketed kettles. So I think it's interesting to see how, we talk about the 1920s. This is the period of marketing, commercialization, and those kind of things. And so the fact that even with all the anti-militarism that's going on, you still see advertisers trying to link themselves with sort of patriotism and the Navy, especially modern things like the Tennessee, the 20s, the Roaring 20s modernism. I think that's fascinating that they have those kinds of ads. Now here's a very interesting part of the Tennessee story, and Dr. Utley wrote about this at some length. The Navy had a plan. It wasn't a good plan, but it was a plan to man the Tennessee entirely with Tennesseans. I don't know if it occurred to the Navy or not, but at that time we didn't even have TVA lakes. We're landlocked. We didn't really, we didn't know much about the Navy. But the idea was, hey, let's get the volunteers to volunteer for the Navy. And even before the christening ceremony, Helen Roberts, a train comes to Tennessee, and they go from one side of the state to the other, and she breaks a bottle of champagne. Broke a lot of champagne bottles. She broke champagne bottles on the train, and they started this thing that the captain of the Tennessee at that time came down and spoke at various places trying to get people to enlist. And it was a fairly successful campaign. They got about 40% of what they thought they needed for the crew, which Dr. Utley thinks, there's a lot of talk in the newspaper articles that they wanted to man the Tennessee completely, that the media got carried away with itself. I think Dr. Utley discovered that they really only wanted about 40% of the crew from Tennessee. That was what their goal was. And they achieved it. They got about 650 people to join during these rallies. And they were to serve aboard the Tennessee with other Tennesseans. And here you can see again, here's another advertisement. Go to sea on the Tennessee, man the newest dreadnought, with men from our own towns and countryside. And then here's another one. If you want to be a Tennessee sailor, cruise the world with home folk boys, talk with your Navy recruiter officer. Here's the unfortunate part. Because the Tennessee was was considered to be so advanced at the time, it took way longer than they thought to get this ship out and operational, which meant that those 650 young men who joined the Tennessee's crew, and I should point out that unfortunately it was segregated, so they're all white young men. They wanted unmarried men too, but a lot of times they lied about that if they needed some money. It'd be hard to support a family on a enlisted junior enlisted salary. But anyway, most of those men signed on for 2 years, and for the first 2 years there was nothing to do. The captain rotated them on 14-day leaves, and they just kind of sat there and painted and scrubbed the rust off, when they needed to. So they never got to see the world with home folk boys. They got to see basically the area around the East Coast when they weren't in port. And it was, by the time many of their enlistments were over, so you had 600 people that you wanted to sort of build up and train into this, very outstanding, capable crew. Most of those 650 young men did not re-enlist, and so they sort of basically started out with a whole new crew. But it was unfortunate that this didn't work out. It sounded like a good idea, but it has problems. As we found out time and time again, when you recruit young men and women from regional areas, whether it's you have, everybody knows the story of Saving Private Ryan, I would think, in here. And how that from families or from certain areas in the Civil War, this was a problem. You get a bad day in battle and you wipe out the male population of a town. even as late as the Persian Gulf War back in 1991. In Dock Ron, there was a town in Pennsylvania lost a number of men when a Scud missile hit a barracks. So these are issues that we still deal with today, but recruitment and all those kind of things are big issues for our military even today. All right, let's get started. Well, throughout the 1920s and 30s, of course, the Tennessee does finally get out and sail the world. Here you can see it traversing the Panama Canal. If you're not familiar with naval architecture, I don't have the students, I have a famous graphic that shows various battleship types. And I asked them to guess which one is an American battleship. But if you're not familiar with naval architecture, American battleships have a particular feature, or I guess they used to. Their beam, which is the width of the ship, is limited to the size of the Panama Canal. No other Navy in the world sort of has that requirement. It does provide, well, when the battleships were out there, it did provide, it was a disadvantage because when you fire these guns, there's a recoil and they will roll, yaw, pitch, whatever, and it takes longer to reset the guns. Just to give you an example, the Bismarck, which was the German commerce raider out on the North Atlantic, it was built with a very broad beam. And one of the advantages of the Bismarck that gave it such a terrifying sort of reputation was that it could reset its guns much faster, because with a broad beam, when they fired its guns, it didn't move very much and could reset faster. So the American Navy has a requirement that you have to be able to pass through the Panama Canal. And so here you can see, if you saw the New Jersey or the Missouri passing through the Panama Canal today, you're talking maybe 6 inches on each side if you're lucky. I mean, those battleships, those last battleships that we built, did not fit in that very well at all. But anyway, you can see the Tennessee and the Panama Canal there. There's another picture of it, a little bit close up, going through the canal zone, and you can see it much wider. There's a lot of room still, but they will get bigger in the next class. The Tennessee was the last battleship the United States Navy put into the water for 20 years. So from 1919 up into World War II, there was not another battleship the United States produced. And so by the 1940s, they would become much bigger. I think everybody probably recognizes this photograph. This is, of course, Pearl Harbor. On the morning of December 7th, 1941. If you look closely, you can even see Japanese planes, in flight around the island there. This is, of course, the famous Battleship Row photograph that you can see. The Tennessee is there. In fact, let's go to the next slide. You can see there, I don't know if I got my laser working or not. Oh, there we go. All right, so let's see, this is going to be a test for me. This is the Oklahoma on the outboard side of the Maryland. Then you'll see the West Virginia. Then you'll see the Tennessee, which is moored next to the quay there on the starboard side of the West Virginia. And then, of course, this is the USS Arizona. It's being tended by the Vestal tender, and then the battleship Nevada is behind it. You can see the Japanese aircraft, at least one of them right there, strafing it. The Tennessee came under attack about 10 minutes to 8 local time in Hawaii. Within about 20 minutes, the White House had been notified of the attack. So by around 8:10, the Tennessee had already been hit once by an aerial bomb. That's just how quick things occurred. I think you know sort of the story of what happens after this. Here you can see, of course, what happens. The Arizona explodes from a bomb hit to its forward magazine, breaks in half, and begins to sink. The Tennessee is in front of it. What you can see here, the damage control parties, they're spraying water into the ocean. And that is because the oil and fuel from the Arizona is now leaking out of the fuel bunkers beneath the water line, and is creating a fire on the surface of the water that is essentially warping the hull plates on the Tennessee. That's how hot the fire is. It's warping several inch thick armor on the Tennessee at that point. So they're trying to push the fire away from the ship. The West Virginia, which is beside the Tennessee, has also sunk from torpedo hits. And we're not going to debate whether or not there were midget submarines or whatever, but those are a lot of discussion about this. Here's another example of the fire control parties, a close-up shot of that. Here's sort of the aftermath of the Pearl Harbor attack. You can see the Arizona, the Arizona here. You can see the Tennessee. The Tennessee had 5 men killed, and that's extraordinarily low considering the other casualties on the other ships. As I mentioned, the Arizona famously sank. It is one of only 2 battleships of the United States. Well, I guess you count the Maine, but at least by hostile action, it's only one of 2 battleships that have ever been sunk, and you're seeing both of them here actually. The Arizona and the Oklahoma that have been irrevocably sunk, I should point that out. The West Virginia, unlike the Oklahoma rolled over. I think most people know this story. The West Virginia's captain was able to sort of counterflood the ship, and it sank sort of flat on the bottom there. And then the Maryland in there. The first bomb hit on the Tennessee actually created a spray of shrapnel that mortally wounded the captain of the Maryland. So the Maryland sort of was in some leadership chaos there for initial few minutes. But yeah, you can see that here. You can see this is sort of another picture. This always just really gets to me. Here you can see the West Virginia. You can see how it sank sort of flat with the counterflooding. You see the Tennessee pretty much undamaged beside it. And this is taken from the hull of the Oklahoma. And as you know, many of you recently probably have seen more and more identifications come out of the military based upon men from the Oklahoma. I've worked with the Department of Defense on remains recovery and in other places like Monterrey, Mexico. But we toured Dover Air Force Base and the Joint Personnel Accounting Command, or whatever they call it now. And they do just such amazing work. And what they've done now, if you don't know this story, the Oklahoma is very tragic because many men inside the Oklahoma were trapped for days, 7 to 10 days, and eventually passed. And so when the Oklahoma was eventually salvaged, and it sank before it could be, it sank again on its tow back to the United States, but the remains they recovered were buried in Hawaii. They found a set of x-rays. I'm getting off track, I apologize for that, but they found a set of x-rays that they did on the enlistment of these soldiers, sailors on the Oklahoma, and they were able to, like fingerprints really, of their chest, tuberculosis x-rays. And so they were able to take the remains out of the cemetery in Hawaii and compare them with those chest x-rays and identify a large number of sailors from the Oklahoma in recent years. So that's why you've probably seen reports of people from the Oklahoma being identified in the Personnel Accounting Command. All right. Again, just sort of trivia if you're interested. This is sort of the after-action report of the Pearl Harbor event. You can see the various the ships there on Battleship Row. I should point out the sister ship of the Tennessee, the California, was not too far off Battleship Row actually, and it too was sunk, but it was refloated like the West Virginia and went back into service. But here you can see where the bomb hits on the Tennessee were located. You see the bomb hits there forward and aft and fragments into the bridge area. But thankfully, because it was on the inboard side, there were no torpedo hits. And eventually what they did was they blew up the concrete quays here and allowed the Tennessee to sort of slip past the Maryland and the Oklahoma and back out. And it was sent back to the United States for repair and refit. Now, the other stories of Pearl Harbor and Tennessee that are related to this are probably well known. Cordell Hull famously entertained the Japanese ambassadors. We were able to decode their messages faster than they themselves could decode them. Not only did we sort of have not enough, but we had some inkling of what was about to happen. The Japanese ambassadors were waiting for their final paragraph to be delivered to them before they could meet with Hull in their response. The United States had told Japan if they didn't stop their aggression that we would sort of cut them off. The Japanese were coming to deliver their ultimatum that they were going to war with us, supposedly to be delivered at the same time the attack started. But they were late because they couldn't decode the message fast enough. And Hull, if you've ever seen the movie Tora, 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 that's verbatim. Hull told them this was the greatest outrage in the history of the world and those kind of things, and really gave them a talking down. And of course, Cordell Hull later would be considered essentially the father of the United Nations. And I think not enough attention is paid to Cornelia Fort in our history courses. I do. If you've ever read Cornelia Fort's last letter, it is a moving testament to her character. But she was at Pearl Harbor famously in the air. Cornelia Fort was born in Nashville. She had 4 or 5 brothers. Her father was served in World War I. He had seen an airplane crash in World War I. He prohibited all his sons from joining from ever flying because of that, for the trauma of seeing that crash. And Cornelia said, well, I wasn't part of that meeting. So she decided to sort of throw off the debutante life that she was intended to live by her parents and be one of the first female aviators in history. In fact, she was hired by the Army to teach pilots how to fly. And she was in Pearl Harbor, Hawaii on December 7th in the air teaching someone to fly when Japanese planes started shooting at her. She may be the only person in the air to survive that first wave at Pearl Harbor. There were several others. But again, if you've seen the movie Tora, 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 this is actually famously recreated, dramatized in the film. Here you can see a screenshot from the film of Cornelia Fort realizing that the Japanese bombers are inbound on Pearl Harbor. So just as she landed, her plane was strafed. Both she and her student managed to get out, but her plane was catastrophically destroyed just seconds after she left. She then returned to the States to continue training pilots, and it was just before she boarded a ship to go back to the States that she wrote a letter to her parents telling them basically goodbye and how much she had enjoyed and appreciated the life that they had given her. And I always read that to my students each semester, and if you haven't read it, I would encourage you to do so. But those are the famous stories of Pearl Harbor. There were some others. Here you can see the state's first war casualty is considered Leland Beasley from Lawrenceburg, Tennessee. And then here's another interesting story, again, that I hope somebody would take up at some point. And again, the media, not sure how truthful sometimes they can be, or especially at this period of time, they don't know a lot of information. Information was slow coming back from Hawaii there, but in this you can see a black gentleman was killed in the Pearl Harbor raid. His name was Ben Edward Holt. The interesting part about this is he was a mess attendant, and I think you probably know some of the famous stories of black sailors and soldiers and Marines at Pearl Harbor, but he was a former student at what becomes Tennessee State University. And so I think that's an interesting aspect of it. Here's a young man who was in a college program and then joined the Navy and was at Pearl Harbor and unfortunately was killed there. So I think we probably need to find out some more about him perhaps. Of course, this Remember Pearl Harbor, that's the RPH Savings Club is formed. Citizens, here you see kids learning to knit. We should do that again probably. Dancing gives way to defense at Vanderbilt. So they're donating the money from their cotillion to local fundraising efforts to help the war effort. Now, again, I wish my colleague Michael Birdwell was still with us. Many of you probably know Birdie, and he was a great student of military history and culture. He passed away a couple of years ago, but he was a big Sergeant York guy, as I was growing up. My mother was a librarian at a school, and I spent a lot of time in the library. I'm the only person in Coffee County that's been banned from doing Alvin York book reports. I think I did so many. I used to, my parents would pick me up at school and drop me off at home and go back to work. And of course, if you remember, some of you remember, some of the early cable stations would just over and over play these patriotic movies like Sergeant York and A Bridge Too Far and Where Eagles Dare and whatever else. So I spent a lot of time watching those as a kid, and Sergeant York was always my favorite. But Sergeant York came out that summer, and Dr. Birdwell would tell you that it was not famous at first. It was considered by a lot of people to be a very political movie. I know, Hollywood never really produces political movies, but even back in the 1940s, this was considered the story of York. If you're not familiar with it in this room, you probably need to talk. But the idea here is that York is a humble farmer, right? Stereotypical American type. And the war starts. He's reluctant to be drafted. He doesn't want to go fight. It's against his morals. But eventually he comes to this reckoning that it's okay. Then he goes and he fights and he does these amazing, great things with a rifle. In the age of machine guns and tanks and planes, the idea of an American with a rifle, right, is very sort of back to the long hunters and everything else. And so here's a man with a rifle. One man can make all this difference in the world. And he comes home, and he's unchanged by the war. He comes back, and he just wants to settle down and live a normal life again. And it's a true story. But many people thought Hollywood was trying to push America into the war, that this was basically an analogy to America, right, that we're going to be reluctant to fight, but when we do decide to fight, we're going to go do these great things, but we're going to come out of this, we're going to be unfazed by it. And we're going to go back to the way we were before. And so that movie was not very popular at first. York himself, and I don't want to overplay this too much, but York himself, of course, had some problems with it because of his religious beliefs and the Jewish producer of the film. But they reconciled all that. But again, the movie in some places is taken out of circulation, but then all of a sudden, in the run-up to Pearl Harbor, it's back in the theaters and becomes this huge hit. And here you can see some of the publicity for that with even Sergeant York. And that's a whole other story. York, one of the most famous American heroes of the 1920s and 30s, is up against another American hero in his beliefs. York actually says, we have to go back to Europe and do this. He's not reluctant this second time. He's like, if we don't do this now, we're going to be, it's going to be worse. But another American hero by the name of Charles Lindbergh opposed him in this and was very isolationist. And so you had these two American heroes debating each other at different events, but doing different speeches, and it was very powerful, time. And then, of course, you can see that once the war starts, we talked about this a little bit yesterday with the maneuvers. I grew up in Coffee County and walking the creek beds and sitting in the foxholes and digging up all kinds of artifacts in the woods from the maneuvers down there, but here you can see Camp Forest, of course. The Vultee plant, the guards at the Vultee plant. The Vultee plant was the first new aircraft factory completed in America between the Allegheny Mountains and the Rockies. So there had not been another aircraft plant built in the 20s and 30s, again, probably because of the Depression and anti-militarism. And they built things like the A-31 Avenger and then the P-38 Lightning, which is one of my favorite aircraft there. But you can see the women and a few men building aircraft engines there. Well, the Tennessee was refit. I know we're back to our story. The Tennessee was refit, and here you can see it in new incarnations. Probably can't tell what it is, but it's a lot of new fire control radars and different aspects of it. It's got a single stack rather than a double stack, all these kind of things. It's more heavily armored. And they go to the Philippines as one of their first operations. And they're going to assist in the liberation of the Philippines. 3 Tennessee women were nurses on the Philippines. 2 managed to escape. The third was captured and spent most of the war in the Philippines as a Japanese captive. This was actually sort of tugged at the nation's heartstrings. They made 3 movies about this before the war was even over. And you can see even John Wayne was part of this story. And you can see the propaganda is part of this story as well. All right, here is one of the angels of Baton. There were 77 of these nurses. One of them was named Geneva Jenkins from here in East Tennessee, Sevier County. And here she is returning from prison camp. saying that she never saw any of the Japanese atrocities, but she heard about them, and had spent the last 2.5 years in Japanese captivity. She and other Angels of Bataan were very sought after for publicity events. And when John Wayne and Patricia Neal's movie came out, even though it wasn't really related to the Angels of Bataan, only tangentially, they invited Geneva Jenkins to the premiere. And here you can see Patricia Neal, Academy Award-winning actress, with Geneva Jenkins and a very lucky soldier, probably. There. Oh, there it is. All right, so the Tennessee is cruising the Pacific now and ready to go back into action, as are the other battleships, with the exception of the Arizona and Oklahoma, tragically. But the other battleships that were damaged at Pearl Harbor are back in action. Other battleships have now come into line too. The Tennessee is now wider. You can't, I don't know if you can really tell it, but they put what were called blisters on the sides of the ship to help against torpedo attacks. This actually makes it incapable of traveling the Panama Canal, so it's now stuck in the Pacific. And if it wants to go back to the East Coast, it's got to go all the way around Cape Horn. So it's going to be tough. But as you know, aircraft carriers become the naval unit. It's the age of carriers now. Battleships are relegated mostly to ground support, fire support operations. Here you can see the battleship Tennessee firing one of those salvos as the Marines go ashore. This is probably at Iwo Jima. We'll get to that story in a minute. One of its first tasks was supporting the Marines on the battle at Tarawa. And I just show you what the power of naval gunfire can do if you've not seen one of these things actually take place before. You're looking at the sort of the west end of the Tarawa Island, and it's just pockmarked with naval gunfire shells. Thousands of rounds of naval gunfire shells. It's amazing that anybody can survive those kinds of bombardments. But they did, and what was supposed to take the Marines just a few hours to take several hundred yards of territory on this atoll turned out to be a 3-day slugfest. So the power of these battleships for ground support operations was incredible. There's a little close-up picture. In fact, the troops actually talked about this. Here's a bunker that has been destroyed on Iwo Jima by the USS Tennessee. But you can see these bunkers are very heavily reinforced concrete and those kind of things out there. All right, so these are thanks from the Marines ashore for the naval gunfire bombardments that these ships provided. We'll get back to Iwo Jima in just a minute. I was telling you about the Philippines. The Philippines is the Battle of Leyte Gulf. It's actually 4 different engagements. The engagement we're concerned about here is the Battle of Surigao Strait. This is the last battleship versus battleship engagement in history. And it's a very famous battle. The Japanese were sitting below Leyte. The United States Navy was preparing to invade. They had 5 of the battleships that were at Pearl Harbor, plus several more that had been added to the fleet since then, that were supposedly providing naval gunfire support for the Marine Corps. When they found the Japanese coming up from the south, they deployed those battleships in what's called crossing the T. In the Navy, you have these broadside. You used to have in the wooden ships, you'd have broadsides. So you wanted your enemy to be sort of in a line coming at you, crossing the T. So you wanted to be going this way so that every ship could pass by and fire a broadside at the front ship of the enemy coming towards you. This is a classic naval tactic. There are very few times in history where you've actually seen it employed, but this is as textbook as it comes. And the Tennessee and the other battleships fire thousands of rounds at the Japanese force. There are like 37 patrol PT boats that attack the Japanese as they come into the engagement. It is a disaster for the Japanese, and it is just one part of the disaster for the Japanese at Leyte Gulf, in which they lost their largest battleship, their second largest battleship, the Musashi. Again, the Tennessee was part of that last engagement. Did it register any hits on the Japanese? It's hard to tell. Everybody was firing, and basically you can see from this diagram here, whatever Japanese ship is coming towards them, is the target, and all the ships just concentrate their fire on that front vessel, and there's no escape once you get into this trap, especially with the geography of that area. So this is Iwo Jima, recognized by Mount Suribachi there. You can see the Tennessee located in the foreground. Here's another painting of the Marines going ashore at Iwo Jima. The Tennessee actually had the firepower they designated the firepower of the Tennessee to go to Mount Suribachi, to the north side of Mount Suribachi. And there's a great story that I'd like to tell you real quickly. I know we're getting to the end of this, but what you see here is a landing ship infantry, LCI, but it has guns attached to it, so it's got the G designation to it. And this is LCI G449. Its captain is Rufus Herring. And 2 days before the invasion, Captain Herring's boat and crew were tasked with taking in on a reconnaissance mission the members of UDT-14, Underwater Demolition Team 14. The underwater demolition teams are the forerunners of the Navy SEALs. Their job is to go and recon the beaches, make sure that the soil is compact enough to have vehicles and men on it, to clear obstacles and so forth. They do a lot of good intelligence work and in very cold water. The waters around Iwo Jima during the battle were around 65, 68 degrees. Most Olympic swimming pools would come up on the Olympics, so about 78 degrees is what you'll see in the Olympic swimming pool. So it was pretty cold. So you had all these guys greased down. They would put axle grease on their bodies to try to keep the heat in, these kind of things. So UDT-14 is one of several LCIs that are going in to perform reconnaissance on the Mount Suribachi side. When they've deployed their swimmers, Lieutenant Yates is on the bridge of LCI 449 when a undisclosed or hidden Japanese gun emplacement fires and hits the bridge of the boat. It kills Yates instantly and knocks out most everybody else on the bridge, and the boat starts to just turn circles as it tries to recover swimmers back from their mission. Herring regains consciousness, regains control of the boat, picks up the swimmers, and makes his way back out. And you can see this is one of the last pictures aboard LCI 449 as it goes into Mount Suribachi that day. This is it coming out. I don't know if sometimes you can see the shell holes in the bridge there, but for his efforts, Captain Herring received the Medal of Honor. And the reason I tell this story is because Carl Yates, the commander of UDT-14 that day, was an MTSU student with us at MTSU. And so wanted to honor him and let people know that he was there for that. Here you can see the gunfire plan. All the various battleships and cruisers had different sectors of gunfire. It's interesting if you ever saw a gunfire plan for this, if you've been in the military before, the way they did the grids is fascinating. It seems much easier than it is today, but again, it's Iwo Jima, so it's not that seemingly that complicated. It's a very small place, really. But you can see where the Tennessee was firing. And the Tennessee actually did pick up some survivors of that LCI group that I was telling you about earlier. And you can see the Tennessee floating as the invasion forces went ashore the next day, firing towards Mount Suribachi. And there's the famous beach with Mount Suribachi in the background. I think everybody knows the flag raising story. What you probably don't know is that the United States is broke at this point, and we're financially about ready to ask for the Japanese to surrender, or at least to make some sort of peace agreement. The Americans are war weary, and it is this picture on Iwo Jima that is used to compel the American population to dig just a little bit deeper in their wallets and sacrifice just a little bit more to last at least the spring and possibly the summer, because unknown to many people, the United States has a plan to try to end the war. Let's see. The other Tennessean I want to tell you about on Iwo Jima is John Willis. He was a pharmacist mate, which is a Navy corpsman. There are for the Marine Corps, there are medics. They're Navy. The Marine Corps is a department of the Navy. The men's department, but I'm just kidding. I'm just kidding. But we have great respect for the corpsmen that travel with us. They didn't ask for the, well, many of them did ask for it, but they're not, they do everything Marines do, and they're highly respected. John Willis was a corpsman with 3rd Battalion, 27th Marines, 5th Marine Division. When he came up, he was wounded himself, had some shrapnel, went back into action, found a wounded Marine in a foxhole, began administering plasma to him when a Japanese grenade came into the foxhole. Willis took the grenade and threw it back out. And then a second grenade came in. He picked it up, and he's got his plasma bottle in one hand, he's picking up the grenade, the other, he's throwing it back out. And then a third, and a fourth, and a fifth, and a sixth, and a seventh, and an eighth grenade came into the foxhole. He got all of them out but the ninth. And the ninth grenade came in and exploded in the foxhole, killing both his patient and John Willis. And for that, he received the Medal of Honor. And so he is one of 5 Tennesseans who won the Medal of Honor in the Pacific. And one of my, he probably won't want me to tell this, but one of my former students, Stephen Thomas, will tell you more about the Medal of Honor in Tennessee tomorrow. But John Willis is one of those recipients from Columbia, Tennessee. And I was very fortunate to take my students not only to Peleliu and Guam, but we're also able to go to Iwo Jima for a day. And here you can see us on top of Mount Suribachi collecting the sand and some of the artifacts and relics. It is a Japanese military base now. It's probably now permanently closed to tourists. We hitched a ride with some veterans. The Japanese and the Americans had a program where the veterans were able to go one day a year in March and do a memorial ceremony. So we hitched a ride with them and got to go. It was a very poignant moment that I'm sure most of us will never forget. But the last Japanese survivors came out of the caves at Iwo Jima in 1949. So yeah. Despite supporting all the Marine invasions in the Pacific, from Tarawa all the way up through the Philippines and Palau, Peleliu, Angar, Iwo Jima, Okinawa. It was at Okinawa that the Tennessee sustained its really only major damage outside of Pearl Harbor by a kamikaze aircraft on April the 12th, 1945. And here you can see the battle diagram. You can see a picture of the battle itself in Okinawa, and you can see the damage report from the kamikaze attack on its starboard side, I believe. So you see that. It wasn't a great deal of damage, but it was somewhat significant. There have been some paintings and things. Here's the best picture of the damage that I've been able to find. It crashed into one of the gun mounts, one of the 5-inch gun mounts, and destroyed it. There were 29 sailors that died and 150 were wounded. That's 6 times the deaths at Pearl Harbor, just in that one kamikaze attack. Here are some other pictures of the damage. You can see where the gun mounts basically just ripped off the turret there, just like a tin can opened up. And then, of course, the Tennessee is on its way waiting to support the invasion of Japan when the United States employs the atomic bombs on Japan at Hiroshima and then Nagasaki. Of course, Tennessee played a role in that too, right? Oak Ridge, not too far from here. The United States program for atomic weapons started in Manhattan. That's why it's called the Manhattan Project. And Columbia University. But New York's not a great place to do this. It's on the coast, so it's susceptible. If the Germans had prioritized some things, they could have had air bombardment, naval bombardment. They could have dropped off. They famously had U-boats patrolling the coast. They dropped off commando teams or whatever. It's not a secure place to perform these kind of experiments, obviously. And in New York City, you have a lot of Asians. You have a lot of Europeans, Italians, Germans. How do you tell who's a spy and who's not? You need a lot of energy for these experiments. There were always brownouts in New York City when they would do these experiments, and so you knew something was going on, but you just didn't know what. And then, of course, they weren't sure what they were doing. I think you've seen Oppenheimer by now. They didn't know what would happen. And so what happens if all of a sudden one of these experiments goes awry? You've just basically taking out your largest port city and a lot of your population for generations if something goes wrong. So they needed a place that was isolated, secure, perhaps behind a set of mountains, perhaps. Somewhere where foreigners stuck out like a sore thumb, generally speaking, where you could tell who was a spy and who wasn't, where there was lots of vacant land, so if something went wrong, you didn't really kill a lot of people. And you needed somewhere where there was a lot of energy, and thanks to the TVA, there was still, at that point, a lot of surplus energy around for these experiments, and that's why Oak Ridge gets what it does. But of course, the Tennessee finds itself in southern Japan. There's a debate, and maybe those Truman scholars can back me up on this. The Tennessee was supposed to be the ship the surrender was signed on. Because of its battle history. It's not the most decorated ship in the Navy. That distinction belongs to the North Carolina, which was produced after the Tennessee in a different class. But Truman's home state is Missouri. And so Truman decided the Missouri, which was a newer class of battleship, the Iowa class, was the ship that the surrender was signed on. But it was supposed to be the Tennessee. That's what I was told. So if you're a Truman expert, maybe you can tell me. Here's a picture of the Victory Parade in Tennessee. Here's some stats on the Tennessee, planes shot down, miles, I don't know if it's got miles traveled. Yeah, they traveled 170,000 miles during the course of the war. Right. 8 Japanese vessels sunk is what they're claiming here. But then it was moved to Philadelphia, where it was sold for scrap, like many of the other battleships, despite all its battleship commendations. And there was no battleship Tennessee anymore. Now the battleship Belle continued to make appearances at various places. The Belle is a very famous artifact on board these vessels. So here is one to commemorate, of all things, Paul Revere's ride. Here's Ben West and Buford Ellington and others commemorating. They had something called Bells Across the Nation program. So they're ringing the Tennessee bell in honor of Paul Revere's ride, I guess. I just find that interesting. Then I think most of you probably in this room, especially with the Howard Baker Public Policy Institute around here, probably know this story. When they commissioned the 7th Tennessee, which I'll get to in a second, when they commissioned the 7th USS Tennessee, they had a commissioning ceremony. Howard Baker, who had been in the Navy himself from up in Scott County, right? Always was taking pictures and doing things, but always a very staunch military supporter. He attended the commissioning ceremony, and when it was over, at the commissioning ceremony, they rang the bell of the battleship Tennessee. When it was over, Baker noticed that the bell was just there, and so he put it in the back of his truck. This is the way Baker, you know how Tennesseans get with their stories, but Baker says I trust Baker, so he put it in the back of his truck and drove it to Scott County. And that is why, if you're interested, on a particular Saturday afternoon now, I think the Scott County Museum is the official USS Tennessee Museum. Has a lot of the artifacts and things there, including the ship's bell, donated by Howard Baker. The Navy wanted it back, but I think somebody said possession is 99%. So the Navy finally agreed to sort of let us have it, and so forth. So it's up there at the Scott County Museum. Now today's USS Tennessee, believe it or not, is almost 50 years old. It is an Ohio-class ballistic missile submarine. It has enough firepower to equal hundreds of Hiroshimas with its ballistic missiles that it launches from beneath the ocean. But what I really like about the USS Tennessee emblem here, the 3 stars are very prominent throughout the logo. You've got America at its best, which is our state slogan. So I think it's very appropriate that this ballistic missile submarine is out there patrolling the seas. In fact, you've probably heard about it. This is actually this is not my headline. This is actually a headline from a newspaper I got. Russia freaked. The U.S. Navy surfaced an Ohio-class submarine as a warning. The Silent Service is called the Silent Service for a reason. You don't know where these things are at any given time. But given the tense relations between Russia and the United States, especially with the part of the Russian Navy in Cuba, in the Caribbean right now, the United States decided to send a warning. And just to give you a sense of how serious this warning is, you see I think that's a cruiser, Normandy, but you see the Tennessee ballistic missile submarine. For those things to surface and people tell them that they're there is a message, okay? But beyond that, you can see a P-3 Orion submarine hunter up here, and well, one of these is P-3.
Yeah, that's P-3.
But this is, you rarely ever see this one. This is another rare bird, if you will. This is an E-6 Mercury. It's called the Doomsday plane. This plane is capable of sending commands out to America's military when things go bad, when command and control is knocked out. These things have everything necessary to launch nuclear missiles and everything else. And so for the Tennessee and for this plane to make an appearance, that's a message. That's not an accident. That's not that's not anything but beware. And so the Tennessee, the USS Tennessee or SSBN Tennessee today is still a powerful part of our military. And I know I've gone over my time period, and I apologize for that a little bit, but I'll be happy to take some questions if they'll allow it. But I appreciate your time today and listening to me talk, and hope you learned something a little bit about Tennessee and its participation in the Pacific War.
Piece of trivia.
Okay. Uh-oh.
Originally, you talked about the sister ship, the USS California. Mm-hmm. Originally, the California was to be built in New York, and the Tennessee was to be built on the West Coast. Well, the California legislature voted to send a golden rivet to the New York naval shipyards to be put into what was then the USS California. Meanwhile, the California congressional delegation leaned on the Navy and swapped the two ships. So to the end of her days, USS Tennessee carried a rivet made out of California gold.
Wow. Do you know where that is? That's an artifact we should have.
So when they scrap her, I've often wondered if somebody found that.
Oh, no. I'll have to add that to my list of Tennessee artifacts that I would like to own or possess one day. God, I did not know that. I did not realize that. Thank you for telling me that. That's an interesting story. Yeah, the way ships get named, which ships have which names, and that kind of stuff is a very political process. And so I'm hoping, we have a new class of submarines coming out, the Columbia class. I don't know if the Tennessee would be retired and the new Tennessee come on to the list, but we'll hope to see. Yeah. Any other questions? All right. Well, question, yes.
Did the Russian ship leave?
No, they're still in the Caribbean as far as I'm aware, last I checked. The United States Navy, espouses that we have the right of free passage in international waters. What is international waters is up for debate these days. But if the United States were to complain about the Russian Navy, I want to say Soviet, but the Russian Navy being in the Caribbean, then Russia's ally China would be like, well, you're in the South China Sea, you're in Norway, you're in the Barents Sea, those kind of things. And so it's just one of those things you just have to make sure everybody's aware. I mean, it's incredible. I'm sure people in this room can tell you, to have young men and women at the controls of these things, making these kind of decisions. How close do you let a Soviet aircraft fly to your ship before you open fire? When do you press the buttons? It's an incredible testament to the training and leadership that they have, that nothing has happened for the last, in Europe, for the last 75 years, right? So, but yes, the Russian Navy still I think they're in Venezuela now. So. All right, well, I thank you again, and thank you to the East Tennessee Historical Society and their sponsors for this. I look forward to the rest of the day. Thank you very much.